Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm Professor G. On May 15th of last week, Nottoway Plantation in Louisiana burned to the ground, and a lot of mixed emotions came out in the news media from this event. There were some that were very sad to see the building burned. There were others who saw it as a sign of slavery and oppression, and were happy to see it finally be taken off the face of the earth. Now, I'm making this video because I want to ask the question, are we obsessed with what has become to be known as plantation pornography? Many of the people who are upset that Nottoway burned to the ground say it was beautiful architecture. I had my wedding there. We were planning a wedding there. It has historical significance as one of the archetypes of plantation neoclassical Greek architecture. And then there are those who say that it was built on the back of slaves, and it stands as a monument to the institution of slavery and the antebellum South, the slave society that it was. And I will tell you that I'm going to try and make this video without any opinion either way. I want to actually make the point that the reason there is such division over Nottoway Plantation and what it means is because we as a nation failed at the end of the Civil War, through Reconstruction, all the way up to the Civil Rights era and today, at doing what was necessary to be done with the passage of the 13th Amendment and the ending of slavery. For those of you who don't know, I'm a scholar in antebellum slave law. It's what I publish, it's what I write on, it's what I study. So I have a dog in this fight and a vested interest in trying to educate people on this topic. And the reason that I got into studying antebellum slave law as a law professor, an area that not a lot of people specialize in, it's because of this very issue. What happened when Nottoway Plantation burned? And this obsession we have with plantations, and that term I like to use, plantation pornography. So, just a brief history of Nottoway Plantation. John Hamden Randolph was the man who actually had the building built. He was from Virginia. However, his father was appointed, I believe, a federal judge in Woodville, Mississippi, which brought John Randolph down here to the area, eventually settling in Louisiana, first as a cotton farmer, and then growing sugarcane. He commissioned Nottoway Plantation, I believe in 1855 is when he bought the acreage that the house would be built on, and he named it Nottoway. He named this new sugar plantation Nottoway, after Nottoway County, Virginia, where he was born. He had over 200 slaves. And at the beginning of the Civil War, as the Union came down the Mississippi River and up from New Orleans as well, he fled with 200 slaves to Texas. So needless to say, this was not a good person. And I can say that, go watch previous videos, because you can't say that these were people of their times, that it was a different era, that slavery was accepted, so therefore we can't, individually look at all these people and say they were all bad. There were plenty of abolitionists at the time. There were plenty of people who believed that slavery was bad and immoral. There were plenty of people who believed that no man should be enslaved. So there were people at the time who openly acknowledged that slavery was an evil institution. So the fact that this man was one of the most preeminent slave owners in the Mississippi River Valley says a lot about who he was. And that this Greek revival building was paid for, I believe in today's money, it was over $2-point-something million, if you account for inflation, for what it cost to make. This building was built by the funds from slave labor. And if you know anything about slavery in Louisiana, and I actually teach and live and work in Louisiana, and one of my most recent articles that was published was about the Louisiana Civil Code and how it regulated slavery, sugar plantations were some of the most horrific places to work, because of the grueling time necessary to not only harvest sugarcane, but to process it, to boil it, the horrific conditions, the long working hours. So, because this was a sugar plantation, and everything that goes along with it, and that he fled to Texas with over 200 slaves, and that slavery was his source of income, it is clear to say that Nottoway Plantation, as it existed all the way up until last week, was built on the backs of slaves, and was built on the back of the institution of slavery. It stood as a monument to the institution of slavery and to the slave society that was the antebellum South. Now, that being said, Am I sorry to see it destroyed? Yes. Am I upset with people who say that it should have been destroyed because it was a monument to slavery? No. The division comes because, and this is where I'm going to tie it all together, that after the Civil War, the society never stopped. It didn't end. The slave society continued simply without the legal enslavement of African Americans. All of the jurists, all of the politicians, all of the law enforcement, all of the people who believed, and go watch some of my previous lessons, that people of African descent were inferior, that slavery was good for them, that it was their place in the hierarchy of nature. Those beliefs didn't end with the passage of the 13th Amendment. The racism, the drive to maintain the social hierarchy, the class system in the post-bellum South after the Civil War didn't end. It just modified. And it modified through Jim Crow all the way up to the Civil Rights era. And you still see systemic racism built into the legal system today that we have been hard-pressed to shake off because we never reconstructed correctly. So my example when I look at Nottoway is, as someone who was raised in a Jewish home, I look at Auschwitz and I look at all the concentration camps where 6 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. They're still around, and they're kept up and they're maintained. And they're maintained so that we don't forget the past. But we're not having weddings at them. We're not having parties at them. And some of that is because they were not built as homes, right? They were built as death factories. So there aren't these Greek colonnades. There aren't these, majestic white homes with manicured gardens. So you wouldn't expect to have that same thing that we have here with plantations in a Nazi concentration camp. But the historical value of keeping the concentration camp, of there being crews to mow the lawns, to paint the buildings, of there being tour guides to take people through it, I believe that's necessary. And why are they still there? Because of the denazification of Germany after World War II. After World War II, the Allies did not let the German populace just shake off what they did and move on with their lives, as is what happened with failed Reconstruction in the post-bellum South, right? German citizens were made to face the atrocities they committed. Denying the Holocaust and things like that were enshrined as being illegal in law. The Allies didn't let the Germans simply walk away from the Holocaust. The same way that in the post-bellum United States, the North and the South just kind of let things go back to status quo antebellum. So, except for the actual institution of slavery, all the racial hierarchies were kept intact. African Americans were second-class citizens, were subjugated to white people, and that was allowed to continue on. So instead of being seen, even though these were homes, and they are beautiful buildings, but instead of being seen for what they were, buildings that were built on the back of enslaved individuals, they always maintained that mystique to people, to white people, in the post-bellum South. And as that generation died off, that learned reverence, and I'm not saying the reverence for the slave system. This is why I want to get to where we are present day, because I don't blame anyone for the two sides in this. And I blame us failing 150, 160 years ago. I don't blame any people today, right? But that learned reverence for these buildings, the well-manicured lawns, the beautiful colonnades, all of that sort of stuff, the weddings, the parties, all those things that happened, it came more about the beauty of the building to many white people than it was about how that building got there. Because those white people were not educated in the horrors of the system that created that building. It's easy to say slavery was bad. It's easy to say slavery was evil. When you actually read the law, when you read the cases, when you read the descriptions, when you read firsthand accounts of it, which many of us in America don't do, and that becomes real, now looking at those buildings takes on a very different tone, a very different light to people. That's why I've made this my mission to study antebellum slave law and to write and teach as much as I can about it. So as those generations continued, what you ended up having and seeing is many white people today say, oh, it's historical architecture. Look how beautiful that building is. Is it beautiful? Absolutely. Is it architect? It's amazing architecture. But that type of architecture and that building only exists because John Randolph had over 200 slaves to work and produce sugar and sugarcane. So the failure to reconstruct the United States after slavery is what led to this divide where now I think white people believe they're fully justified. And not just white people, anyone saying it's a beautiful building, it's a shame it's gone. And on the flip side of that coin, African Americans are well within their rights to look at it the same way that a Jewish person looks at Auschwitz. And if Auschwitz had, Auschwitz, because it was a death camp, it doesn't have a home like a plantation home does here, but we would never consider having weddings or bar mitzvahs or parties at Auschwitz or a death camp. That's what you have to understand. African Americans look at a lot of these places, built on the backs of their enslaved ancestors, in the same light. You're having a wedding in a ballroom where in 1860, outside in that field, if this was the same wedding going on, would be 200 enslaved individuals. And all the nuances and horrors that came with the institution of slavery. So I don't blame a lot of white people for today for getting upset when they see comments from African Americans saying they're glad that it burned down. I blame our history for not educating that white person or whoever it was, educating them enough to understand why African Americans are happy that it burned to the ground and why they don't feel any pain or anguish. And not all, right? There are many African Americans who are on the news saying it was a horrible thing that it burned down. That plantation did a lot for the economy of the area that it was in. So a lot of people are going to be hurt from this, but just straight historically speaking, the reason there is such a disconnect, the reason that people are angry at African Americans for being happy that it burned down is because we were never reconstructed correctly. No white person today is responsible for slavery 200 years ago. And that goes without saying. But it's still our duty to understand it. It's our responsibility to learn it. And it's our responsibility to see the reaction, let's say, of when you see an African American person happy that the plantation burned to the ground, to understand why that's a reasonable response. Or why the African American community today has a distrust of the legal system, because that legal system that existed in the antebellum South continued in the postbellum South, just simply without the institution of slavery. But all the racial hierarchy, the racist jurists, the racist politicians, the racist individuals continued to live and create laws to maintain that hierarchy, that system that existed in the slave society of the antebellum South. So again, to tie this all together, when I see the two sides fighting over Nottoway Plantation, I feel for both sides. And I'm sad for both sides because I don't think this is an indictment on either side. I think this is an indictment on our educational system failing to educate both sides of the horrors of the system. Because there are many African Americans who truly don't even know how horrible slavery was. So for the people that believe Nottoway burning down is a good thing, I think they're justified in believing that. For the side that believes that it was a horrible thing for Nottoway to burn down, I believe that too. Because I really think that plantations need to exist, but not necessarily for weddings, not necessarily for parties. There should be museums. In the same way that death camps, Nazi death camps, are museums to educate people on the horrors of the Holocaust, these plantations need to exist. But instead of seeing the reenactors in hoop skirts and dresses on the porches drinking sweet tea and leading you through the mansion, talking about the paintings on the wall or the tapestries or everything else, they need to really be educating you, sure, in period attire, I don't care, but educating you on what this plantation was about, why it exists, why it was here, why there was so much money along the Mississippi River. Why, for example, Natchez, Mississippi had more millionaires per capita in 1860 than I think anywhere in the world, or rivaled New York City in terms of millionaires. So I think these plantations do need to exist. I think they do need to seeing it burn down was heartbreaking to me. because there goes another example of what could have been used to reconstruct us correctly, to have us come to terms with the horrors of slavery and really understand. Every time I see a plantation, I see an example of the slave society of the antebellum South. Not a society with slaves, but the slave society of the antebellum South. So I encourage everyone involved on both sides to maybe take a breath and look at each other and realize that in 2025, it's not the fault of people who, people who say it's a beautiful home, it's a terrible loss. They mean that. They genuinely mean that. I don't think they're being racist. I don't think they're being, ignorant. They're uneducated in what that building, in all of its beauty, should have stood for and should have been used for, to educate people of what actually went on there, as opposed to being just a venue for weddings and parties to get dressed up. And I guess, in some really perverse sort of way, relive that high society era that many white people today only see the Gone with the Wind, Scarlett O'Hara, lost cause reinvention of what slavery was and high society in the antebellum South. We will never end that unless these places exist and are used to educate people on the horrors of antebellum slavery and the slave society that was the antebellum South.